I was standing at the kitchen sink, rinsing the breakfast dishes when my phone rang. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of morning where the light comes in flat and gray through the window, and the yard outside looks like someone drained all the color out of it overnight. The call was from a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, but no name attached. I almost let it go. I had things to get done that morning. I had been putting off going through my father's storage unit in Barrie for 3 weeks already, and my sister had started leaving messages about it that had a particular edge to them, the edge that comes when someone feels they are doing more than their share and wants you to know it without saying it directly. I picked up. "Is this Kenneth?" The voice on the other end was a woman, maybe late 50s, slightly out of breath, like she had been moving things around or climbing stairs. "It is," I said. "My name is Debbie Arsenal. I'm the property manager at Lakeview Self-Storage on Dunlop. Your father had a unit here. You're listed as next of kin on the rental agreement." "I know," I said. "I've been meaning to get out there." There was a pause, not a long one, but weighted in a way I noticed. "Mr. Kenneth," she said, and she said my last name carefully, the way people do when they are about to say something they want you to hear. "Precisely. I was doing a routine walkthrough this morning, and I found that your father's unit was unlocked. The padlock was open. I don't know if you authorized someone to go in there, but I think you should come out and take a look before anything gets disturbed further." I asked her if anything was missing. She said she didn't know, that she hadn't gone through it, that she thought I should be the one to do that. I told her I'd be there within the hour. I should explain a few things. My father's name was Douglas Holt. He passed away in July, 4 months before that phone call. He was 73 years old. He had been living alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Barrie, Ontario for the last 9 years, since my mother died, and he decided the house in Orillia was too much to maintain by himself. He was not a wealthy man, but he had been careful with money his entire life in the way that people who grew up without it tend to be. He had worked for 31 years as a machinist at a plant outside Barrie, retired at 62, and lived quietly on his pension and his savings, and the small RRSP he had contributed to steadily every year from the time he was 35. We were not estranged, my father and I, but we were not close in the way some fathers and sons are close. We talked on the phone maybe twice a month. I drove up to see him 3 or 4 times a year. He came to our place in Hamilton for Christmas, and sometimes Thanksgiving. He was a quiet man who kept his interior life private, not because he was cold, but because he had grown up in a generation that considered emotional disclosure a form of weakness. He loved his grandchildren in the particular wordless way that some men love people, showing up, fixing things, pressing money into hands without fanfare. He had died of a stroke. Sudden, the doctor said. No significant warning. The storage unit had been his solution to a practical problem. When he moved from the house in Orillia to the apartment in Barrie, he couldn't bring everything with him, but he also couldn't bring himself to get rid of any of it. My mother's things were in there. Boxes of old documents, tools from the garage, furniture he didn't have room for. He had been paying the monthly rental fee on that unit for 9 years, and as far as I knew, had rarely gone back into it. My sister Joanne had suggested we let the storage unit lease run out and donate whatever was inside to charity. I had been the one who said we should go through it first. I didn't have a strong reason for that position other than a vague feeling that something in there might matter. I had been putting off acting on that feeling for 3 weeks. The drive from Hamilton to Barrie is about 1 hour and 15 minutes depending on traffic. I made it in just under 90 minutes because the 400 was backed up south of Bradford. I called my wife from the car and told her where I was going and why. She asked if I wanted her to come. I said I thought I was fine, that it was probably nothing, probably someone who had the wrong unit. She said okay. She said to call if I needed anything. Debbie Arsenal met me in the parking lot. She was a compact, practical-looking woman in a fleece vest with the storage company logo on it. She walked me through the facility to the unit, which was on the 2nd floor, interior row, number 214. She told me she had found the padlock hanging open on her morning walk at around 8:15. She said the unit number matched the name on my father's account. She said she had waited outside in the hall for about 10 minutes, listening. Before she was satisfied, no one was still inside. I asked her if there were security cameras. She said there were cameras at the entrance and exit of the facility, and one at the elevator but not in the interior hallways. She left me alone at the door and said she would be downstairs if I needed her. I stood there for a moment before I pulled the door up. The unit was a 10 by 15. My father had organized it the way he organized everything deliberately, with a logic that made sense if you understood how his mind worked. Boxes were labeled and stacked against the walls. Furniture was pushed to the back and covered with moving blankets. There was a narrow path down the center that let you walk in without climbing over things. The path was still clear. Nothing was overturned, nothing scattered. Whatever had happened here had not been chaotic. But at the back, behind a small wooden dresser I remembered from my parents' bedroom in Aurelia, there was a metal filing cabinet. 2 drawers, standard office type, the kind you could buy at any Staples. It had been moved slightly, pulled away from the wall at an angle, the way you would move a piece of furniture if you were trying to get behind it or beside it. The bottom drawer was open. I walked back to it slowly, the way you approach something when you're not sure yet whether it represents a problem. Inside the bottom drawer was a collection of hanging folders, the kind with the plastic tabs that you label. Most of the tabs were in my father's handwriting: insurance, vehicle, house Aurelia, will and estate, things like that. But one folder was out of place. It was lying flat on top of the other folders rather than hanging with them, and the papers inside it were partially displaced, sticking out at angles, as though someone had gone through them quickly and replaced them imperfectly. I picked it up. The tab label said, in my father's handwriting, RFG. I did not immediately know what RFG stood for. I sat down on the moving blanket covering a chair at the back of the unit and opened the folder. There were bank statements in there, printouts from my father's personal account going back 4 years. He had highlighted certain entries in yellow, the kind of careful, deliberate highlighting that tells you someone has been looking at something for a long time, going back to it, comparing it. The highlighted entries were withdrawals, varying amounts. $3,000 here, $4,500 there, sometimes monthly, sometimes not. Always listed in the statement as authorized transfer, investment account. Across the top of the first page, my father had written 2 words in pen, when authorized. I sat with those pages for a long time before I continued reading. My father, it turned out, had had a financial advisor for the last 11 years, a man named Stuart Perot. He ran a small independent investment firm out of an office on Bayfield Street in Barrie called Ridgefield Financial Group. RFG. I knew about Stuart Perot in the vague way you know about the practical details of a parent's life. My father had mentioned him once or twice, said he was careful, said he'd done well with the RRSP. I had no reason to look more closely, and so I hadn't. According to what was in that folder, my father had looked more closely. He had started looking closely about 2 years before he died. The second document in the folder was a handwritten list. My father's printing, small and precise, the kind of handwriting you develop in a trade where measurements matter. He had listed 11 transactions by date, amount, and what the bank statement said about them. Beside each one, he had written a question in the margin. 3 of them said, ask Stuart, not explain to my satisfaction. 2 of them said, compare to contract. 1 said, where is this going exactly? The third document was a copy of his original investment agreement with Ridgefield Financial Group, signed 11 years ago. My father had gone through it with a fine point pen, circling passages, drawing lines in the margins. On page 4, he had drawn a large circle around a clause about discretionary management fees. Beside it, in the margin, he had written, I don't remember this clause. Different paper. Check original. I put the folder down and stood up. I walked to the front of the unit and back again. I did it twice. Then I went through the rest of the filing cabinet. The top drawer contained what you would expect: insurance policies, the deed to the Aurelia house, which we had sold after he moved, his pension documentation, his will, which I already had a copy of. None of it was unusual. At the very back of the top drawer, behind a manila envelope containing his vehicle registration, was a small hardcover notebook. The kind you can get at Dollarama or any pharmacy. Dark green cover, no label. I almost missed it. It had been pushed back as far as it would go, tucked behind the envelope as though placed there specifically to be unobtrusive. The first page had a date on it from 2.5 years ago. The handwriting was my father's, but slightly more deliberate than his usual printing, like a man writing something he intended to keep rather than something he intended to discard. He had been keeping notes. The first few entries were observations. He had written down each time he'd called Stuart Perot's office with a question about a transaction. He had noted who he spoke to, what they said, whether it satisfied him. The third entry said, spoke to Stuart directly this time. He said it was a portfolio maintenance fee. I asked him to show me where in the contract it was authorized. He said he would email it. The email came 3 days later. The clause he referenced is on a page that is numbered 4A. My copy of the contract goes from page 4 to page 5. There is no page 4A. I found my father's original copy of the investment contract in the same envelope as the notebook. Sure enough, page 4, page 5. 4A. I had to put everything down and go stand in the doorway of the unit for a few minutes because the air at the back felt suddenly thin. The entries continued. Over the following 18 months, my father had tracked 9 additional withdrawals he had not been able to get a clear explanation for. The amounts ranged from $2,000 to $8,000. The total he had calculated by hand at the bottom of one page came to just under $54,000. But the entries about money were not the part that stopped me where I was. About 2/3 of the way through the notebook, the tone changed. My father was not a man who put his feelings on paper as a general rule. But the entries from the last year of his life had something in them that I can only describe as exhaustion. Not dramatic exhaustion, just the quiet, worn-down kind that comes from carrying something alone for too long. He had started at around the same time the withdrawals began in earnest, to have headaches, persistent ones at the back of his skull and behind his eyes. He had gone to his family doctor, a GP at a clinic on Georgian Drive that he'd been seeing for years, who had done blood pressure checks and sent him for an MRI. The MRI came back showing nothing alarming. He was prescribed something to manage the headaches and told to reduce his sodium intake and drink more water. The headaches had not improved. And then, in one entry from 14 months before he died, tucked into the middle of a paragraph about his medication dosage, my father had written something that I have not been able to stop reading since. The tea. When did I start drinking the tea? I did not understand what that meant the first time I read it, but I understood it 4 entries later. About 2 years before he died, Stuart Perot had given my father a gift, nothing elaborate. A small wicker basket with a selection of loose-leaf teas, the kind of gift you give an older client at the holidays to seem thoughtful without spending much. My father had mentioned it at Christmas that year. He'd said Stuart had given him some fancy teas. He'd seemed mildly pleased by it. My father was a tea drinker, had been all his life. He had started drinking one of those teas every evening, a blend his notebook described as dark, slightly bitter, says it's for circulation and blood pressure. Stuart said his wife orders it from a health shop in Collingwood. In the notebook entry from 14 months before his death, he had written, "I've been drinking this tea for close to 2 years. The headaches started about 3 months after I started. I stopped taking it for 2 weeks in August to see. The headaches were better. I started again in September. They came back within 10 days. I think I need to have this looked at. I don't want to make an accusation I can't support. I need to find out what's in it first." He had written at the bottom of that page, "I have a say saved in the tin, in the back of the cupboard above the fridge. The small red tin. If anything happens to me before I figure this out, that's where it is." My father had been dead for 4 months. I drove to his apartment directly from the storage facility. I still had a key. My sister and I hadn't finished clearing it out yet, which was part of the ongoing tension between us. I let myself in and went straight to the kitchen. The cupboard above the fridge had a collection of things my father had pushed to the back over years because he didn't use them and didn't want to throw them away. An old percolator, some camping gear from the 90s, a fondue set still in its original box, and at the back, a small red tin. The kind that usually holds throat zinjas or hard candies. Inside it were 2 small paper envelopes of loose-leaf tea, each one sealed with a sticker, no label, no brand name. Just 2 packets. I put them in my coat pocket. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with them, but I knew I was not going to leave them there. I went back to the notebook that evening, sitting at my own kitchen table in Hamilton while my wife put the kids to bed. The last entry in the notebook was dated 9 days before my father had his stroke. It was the longest entry in the book. He wrote that he had been going back and forth about whether to go to the police. He wrote that he had no proof that anything was wrong with the tea, only his own observations about his own body, and that a man his age making accusations about his financial advisor based on headaches and suspicious bank statements might not be taken seriously. He wrote that he had started to wonder if he was being paranoid. He also wrote that he had decided he was not. He had written, "I'm going to call my son this week. Kenneth needs to know about this. I've been too careful for too long. I was trying to be certain before I said anything. I don't know if I'm going to get more certain without help." He had never made that call. I read that paragraph 6 times. I don't know if that helped me understand it any better. I called my wife into the kitchen and showed her the notebook. She read it without saying anything. When she finished, she looked at me for a moment in the particular way she looks at me when she is being careful with her words. She said, "You need to call a lawyer in the morning. Not the police yet. A lawyer first." She was right. She usually is. I found a lawyer through a recommendation from a colleague at work, a woman named Patricia Enright, who practiced in Barrie and had dealt with financial fraud cases before. I called her the next morning and gave her a summary of what I had found. She asked me to bring everything: the notebook, the bank statements, the contract, both copies, the tea samples. She said not to contact Stuart Perot under any circumstances. She said not to mention any of this to anyone outside my immediate family until she had reviewed the materials. I met with her 2 days later. She went through everything methodically, asking questions, taking notes. She said the contract discrepancy alone was worth pursuing. She said the pattern of withdrawals was consistent with something she had seen before: discretionary fee arrangements that were buried in documentation, sometimes added to documents after the fact. She said that was fraud if it could be proven, and the fact that my father had kept his own contemporaneous records was significantly more useful than most clients brought her. She paused when we got to the tea. She said, "Have you had these tested?" I said not yet. She said she was going to recommend I send them to a private lab before going to police, so that whatever came back couldn't be attributed to contamination from chain of custody issues. She had used a lab in Toronto before for a similar situation. She gave me the name. I sent the samples by courier the next day. The results took 3 weeks. When Patricia called me with them, I was in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store. I remember that specifically because I had been in the middle of a completely ordinary errand, and I sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes after she called before I felt ready to drive. The tea samples contained elevated concentrations of a compound called pyrrolizidine alkaloids. It's a naturally occurring substance found in certain plants, more commonly associated with herbal supplements and traditional medicine blends that have not been quality controlled. In small amounts, it causes few obvious symptoms. In sustained, repeated ingestion over a period of months or years, it is hepatotoxic, meaning it causes liver damage, and it is also known to elevate blood pressure and cause persistent headaches, particularly in older adults. Prolonged exposure can, in combination with pre-existing cardiovascular vulnerability, contribute to cerebrovascular events. My father had died of a stroke. His headaches had started 3 months after he began drinking that tea every evening. He had stopped for 2 weeks and they improved. He had started again, and they returned. Patricia filed a complaint with the Ontario Securities Commission on the financial side within the week. She had already identified that the page 4A in Stuart Perot's version of the contract had a different paperweight and a slightly different font size than the surrounding pages. She had it examined by a document analyst. The finding was that the page had been inserted after the original contract was assembled. The OSC investigation moved quickly once the documentation was in front of them. A forensic accountant they brought in found that the pattern of withdrawals from my father's account was replicated across 6 other client accounts at Ridgefield Financial Group, all of them older clients, all of them in the same age range, all of them with similar profiles, retired, modest savings, less likely to scrutinize statements closely. The total across all accounts was over $400,000. The tea was handled separately by Barrie Police with support from an Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit that had already been looking at Stuart Perot for a year before I walked into Patricia's office. I didn't know that at the time. I found out later that my father had not been the first person to raise concerns about Perot. There had been a complaint from another client 2 years earlier that had gone nowhere, because there was not enough documentation to support it. My father's notebook was the documentation they had been missing. The criminal charges took time. Fraud over $5,000 came first. The charge related to the tea, criminal negligence, took 8 months longer and required a toxicology expert to testify about the relationship between sustained pyrrolizidine alkaloid ingestion and the type of stroke my father had experienced. The Crown was careful about how they characterized it. They did not argue that the tea was the direct cause of his death. They argued that Stuart Perot had knowingly supplied a substance to a client that he had reason to believe was harmful, and that his failure to disclose this or warn against continued use constituted criminal negligence. What came out during the investigation, the part that I have had the hardest time sitting with, is that Stuart Perot had an arrangement with my father's younger brother, my uncle. His name is Victor. He is 11 years older than me, my father's only sibling, and he lives in Midland. He and my father had not been close for most of my adult life. There had been a disagreement over my grandmother's estate when she died, the kind of disagreement that doesn't fully heal, and they had settled into a distant civil relationship where they called each other on birthdays and saw each other at funerals. Victor had told Stuart Perot about my father's accounts. He had mentioned the amount, the RRSP, the pension, the savings. He had been specific enough that Perot had gone into that relationship knowing what he was working with. The investigators found that over the same period during which money was being pulled from my father's account, a series of cash deposits had appeared in Victor's bank account. Not large amounts. $800 here, $1,200 there. Traced back through 2 intermediary accounts to a numbered company registered by Stuart Perot's wife. Victor said he didn't know what Perot intended to do with the information. He said he thought Perot was going to offer my father a better investment product and that Victor might get a referral fee. He said he had no idea about the tea or about any of it. I have known Victor my whole life. I have been to his house at Christmas. I stood beside him at my father's funeral. He had his arm around my shoulders at the gravesite. I don't know what he knew. I genuinely don't know. What I know is that my father had written, in the notebook near the end, 2 lines I didn't fully understand until the investigation was over. He wrote, "I think I know how Stuart found out about my accounts. I think I know, and I hope I'm wrong. I'm not going to write it here because if I'm wrong, saying it would do more damage than the silence. If I'm right, Kenneth will figure it out. He's a careful person. He takes after his mother. He had figured I would get there. He had trusted me to get there without being pointed there directly because he couldn't bring himself to put his brother's name in that notebook and leave it in a filing cabinet in a storage unit in case he was wrong. He was not wrong. Stuart Perot was convicted on the fraud charges. He was sentenced to 4 years. The criminal negligence charge was stayed after the toxicology expert's testimony was successfully challenged on a procedural point, something to do with the lab methodology that Patricia explained to me twice and that I understood intellectually and could not absorb in any other way. He served 18 months and was released on parole. Victor pleaded guilty to a lesser charge in exchange for his cooperation with the prosecution. He received a conditional discharge and 2 years of probation. I haven't spoken to him since the sentencing. I don't say that because I'm certain it's permanent. I say it because I genuinely don't know yet what kind of conversation would make sense, or when, or whether one is possible. He is in his 80s. He lost his brother. He has to live with what he did, which may be punishment enough or may not be. I haven't been able to decide where I land on that, and I've stopped trying to force it. The civil suit recovered most of what was stolen from my father's estate, plus damages that Patricia pursued aggressively and won. I put a portion of it into an arespic for my kids. My father would have approved of that specifically, the practical gesture, the quiet future orientation, something useful, no ceremony. I still have the green notebook. I've thought about what it meant that he almost called me. 9 days before he died, he had decided to stop being careful and just tell me. He had decided I needed to know. And then he ran out of time, not because he was careless, but because he was too thorough. Because he spent 2 years trying to be certain before he said anything, because he was a machinist, and machinists measure twice and cut once, and he was still on his first measurement when the clock ran out. I think about that. I think about it a lot. There is a line near the end of the notebook, in one of the later entries, that I have read so many times the page has a soft crease across it now from being opened and closed. He was writing about whether to trust his own conclusions after so long second-guessing himself. He wrote, "A man who spends his whole life being careful with money doesn't just forget what he signed. I know what I signed. I know what I didn't sign. That's still true even if I can't prove it yet." He was right. He couldn't prove it yet. But he had kept every piece of paper, every bank statement, every question he had written in a margin, every time he had circled something and put a question mark beside it. He had kept all of it in a drawer in a storage unit in Barrie, organized the way he organized everything, with a logic that made sense if you took the time to understand how his mind worked. I took the time. That's what he was counting on. My father was not a man who talked easily about the things that mattered to him. He showed them instead. He showed up when you needed him. He pressed money into hands without fanfare. He kept records. He saved tea in a small red tin and told a notebook where to find it. That was how he loved the people he loved, quietly and with evidence.